Welcome to another story made by Oracle One, the nurse of No Man's Land. Rain fell in thin silver sheets across the broken landscape of northern France, turning the earth into a sucking mire that swallowed boots and bodies alike. The year was 1917, and the Great War had already chewed through 3 years of Europe's suns. Along the Western Front, between the endless trenches and tangled wire, lay a stretch of blasted soil so scarred that even the rats had grown cautious. It was called No Man's Land, and it was there, beneath the crimson flicker of flares and the dull thunder of artillery, that Clara Whitmore worked. Clara had been a nurse for the British Army since the first months of the war. She was 26 now, her face leaner, her eyes harder, though once they had been the sort to sparkle with laughter. She had grown up in a quiet English village, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. When the war began, she volunteered out of duty, or perhaps defiance, when her father said no proper woman belonged near the front. But Clara had a stubborn heart, and something more had pulled her across the channel, a memory of a man. Captain James Haversham. He had been her father's prized pupil, a scholar with a soldier's bearing, kind yet restless. They had spent long evenings before the war walking along the riverbank near her home, speaking of books and dreams. He had promised to return for her after the fighting was done. Then came the letters, at first frequent and tender, later fewer and more haunted, until one day they stopped entirely. Rumor reached her that his regiment had been lost during the Somme offensive. But war had a way of twisting truth. It was late autumn when Clara overheard the name again. She had been tending to the wounded in a makeshift hospital near Ypres when an injured corporal was brought in, his leg shredded by shrapnel. In his delirium he mumbled about a Captain Haversham taken prisoner after a failed patrol beyond the lines. Something inside Clara flared alive, a spark she had long buried beneath duty and despair. That night, as the guns fell silent for a few fleeting hours, she made her decision. By dawn, she had disguised herself in a drab gray cloak, taken a field pack of medical supplies, and slipped away from the British camp under the pretense of fetching morphine from a nearby depot. But she did not turn toward safety. She crossed the shallow trenches and crept toward the desolation beyond. No Man's Land stretched before her like a graveyard of the world. The earth was churned and pocked with shell holes filled with stagnant water. Barbed wire glistened like spider silk, its metal teeth slick with rain. The air stank of mud, gas, and decay. Every few minutes the horizon lit up with orange fire as artillery boomed from both sides, tearing apart what little remained of the soil. Clara moved on her knees through the muck, every step a prayer. She could feel her heart beating in her throat, each thud reminding her she was still alive, something she could not say for the hundreds of broken shapes lying around her. She kept her gaze low, her breath shallow, until she reached the twisted remnants of a shattered tree. There she paused, scanning the darkness. Somewhere beyond that ruined wood lay the German lines. If James was alive, he would be there, captive or worse. The first whisper of dawn brushed the clouds when she found them, a group of German sentries stationed near a collapsed bunker. She waited until one turned away, then crawled toward a nearby ditch. Inside, half buried under mud and splintered boards, lay a row of wounded soldiers, some groaning softly, others long gone cold. Her eyes flicked across the faces until one made her heart stop. James. He was thinner than she remembered, his uniform torn and crusted with dried blood, but the line of his jaw and the curve of his mouth were unmistakable. His eyes fluttered open, dazed, and for a heartbeat he seemed unsure whether she was real. "Clara?" His voice was barely a whisper. She pressed a finger to his lips. "Quiet. I'm here." Tears stung her eyes, but she swallowed them back. She cut the ropes that bound his wrists and checked his wounds. A deep gash ran along his side, poorly bandaged, and infection had set in. He was burning with fever. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured weakly. "I couldn't not come," she replied. "You promised you'd return." A faint smile tugged at his cracked lips. "I meant to." There was no time for reunion. Voices sounded nearby, German soldiers speaking in low tones. Clara glanced around and saw a small cart at the edge of the ditch, half covered by a tarpaulin. She hauled James toward it, every muscle straining. The mud clung to them like glue, but adrenaline lent her strength she did not know she possessed. She hid him beneath the tarp just as a sentry approached. Clara grabbed a blood-stained bandage from her pack and began wrapping it around her arm, muttering softly in broken German about medical supplies. The soldier frowned, demanded something she could not fully understand, then, satisfied or disinterested, turned away. Clara waited until he vanished into the haze before daring to breathe again. She pressed her hand against the tarp. "Hold on," she whispered. The journey back was a nightmare. She pushed the cart through mud that threatened to swallow the wheels whole, pausing every few feet to listen for patrols. Twice she had to throw herself flat as flares burst overhead, turning the night to silver and shadow. Once, the ground shook as shells exploded dangerously close, showering her with earth and bone. By some miracle, she reached a stretch of collapsed trench where the British line had once advanced months before. It was empty now except for ghosts. There she dragged James beneath a corrugated iron sheet and set about cleaning his wounds with trembling hands. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling her name, sometimes muttering orders from battles long past. She worked feverishly, her medical training guiding her even as exhaustion clawed at her. She cleaned the wound, poured the last of her antiseptic, and bound it tightly. When at last she stopped, she could barely feel her fingers. She leaned against the wall of the trench, gasping for breath. James's hand found hers in the dark. "I thought you were a dream," he whispered. "Then hold on to the dream," she said softly. For the next 2 days, they hid among the ruins. She rationed what little food she had, melted rainwater in a tin cup, and prayed the Germans would not sweep the area again. When his fever broke, she dared to hope. But she knew they could not stay. Sooner or later, both sides would resume bombardment. On the third night, under a shroud of mist, she decided to move. The nearest British trench was less than a mile away, but between them stretched open ground crawling with patrols. She wrapped James in a tattered blanket, helped him to his feet, and together they stumbled through the darkness. Every step was agony. James could barely walk, leaning heavily on her shoulder, his breath ragged. Once he fell, dragging her down with him. They lay in the mud, hearts pounding, as footsteps approached. German voices echoed faintly through the fog. Clara pressed herself against the ground, willing them to pass. When silence returned, she hauled him up again. The first flicker of dawn crept over the horizon when they reached the remnants of the wire. Beyond it, she could see the faint outline of the British parapets. Home, or what passed for it. A flare burst overhead, bathing them in cold white light. Shouts erupted from both sides. The ground around them exploded as bullets tore through the air. Clara screamed for James to crawl, pushing him ahead even as the mud erupted in sprays around them. She felt a sudden sharp pain in her shoulder but kept moving, dragging him forward until rough hands seized them from the British side and pulled them into the trench. Voices shouted orders. Medics rushed forward. Someone shouted her name. Then everything went black. When Clara awoke, the smell of ether filled her nose. She was back at the field hospital, her shoulder bound in linen. Rain drummed softly on the canvas roof. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed it all. Then she turned her head and saw him. James lay on the cot beside her, pale but alive, his chest rising steadily. When he saw her stir, he smiled faintly. "You always were stubborn," he murmured. "You gave me a promise," she said. I only came to collect it. Tears slipped down his cheek. You risked your life. I did my duty, she replied, though her voice trembled. A nurse saves lives, even one she once loved. He reached out, and she took his hand. For a long while, they said nothing. Outside, the guns rumbled again, but the sound seemed far away. In that small tent, for the first time in years, the war paused. Days turned to weeks. James recovered slowly under Clara's care. Rumors spread among the soldiers about the nurse who had crossed No Man's Land to rescue a prisoner. Some dismissed it as legend, others swore it was true. Clara herself said nothing. She returned to her duties as if nothing had happened, though she carried a new scar on her shoulder and a deeper one in her heart. One evening, as the winter sun bled red across the horizon, James came to her with a crumpled piece of paper in hand. They're sending me home, he said. Medical discharge. They want me to recover fully. She nodded, forcing a smile. That's good news. You should come, he said quietly. Leave this place. Start again. Her heart ached. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine it. A small house, a garden, mornings without gunfire. But she shook her head. There are too many still here who need me. I can't. He looked at her, eyes filled with both love and sorrow. You've given enough. Not yet, she whispered. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. Then I'll wait, he said. However long it takes. When he left, she watched until his figure vanished into the mist. Then she turned back to the hospital tents, where new wounded were already arriving. She picked up her basin and went to work. Months later, when the armistice was declared, Clara remained behind to tend to the final wave of casualties. The guns were silent at last, but the moans of the broken still filled the air. She moved among them like a spirit, steady, tireless, her presence a quiet miracle. Soldiers whispered her name with reverence, the nurse of No Man's Land. Years passed. Peace returned, though scars remained upon the land and its people. Clara finally went home, to a small cottage overlooking the same river where she and James had once walked. He was there waiting, older, limping slightly, but with the same gentle eyes. They married in the spring, under trees that bloomed as if the world itself were healing. Yet sometimes when the wind blew from the east, carrying the faint scent of rain and iron, Clara would close her eyes and see again that desolate plain, the flashes of light, the endless mud, and the face of the man she had carried from death's shadow. And she would whisper a silent prayer for all those she could not save, for all the names lost to the earth. But in the quiet that followed, she would feel James's hand in hers, warm and alive, and know that love had won one small victory in the heart of that vast, cruel war. For more stories, like and subscribe.